Right. So, tree identification. Today, we're going to go over the tree twigs, buds, and leaf samples. We're going to talk about plant classification, which is really important. For IDing a tree, you can't treat a tree, you can't figure out what's going on with it unless you know what it is, right? So, plant classification, what family it falls into, we'll go over all that. The scientific names versus the common names. The use of plant characteristics in tree identification, because all trees are a little different. They're even different when they're younger and older. We'll find out about that kind of stuff too. The leaf arrangement and its morphology. We're going to talk about leaf shapes and their characteristics and how you ID different parts of the leaf. And then bud and twig characteristics. We're going to go over that too. Okay. All that helps in identifying what tree you're working with. It's easy to know the most common ones in your area, right? Most people can point out a white oak down here, southern red oak, tulip poplar maybe, or their smaller favorite ones that flower. But other than that, it gets a little tricky, right? So identifying before diagnosing, like I said, or treating a tree or prescribing care, you really want to know what you're dealing with because different trees require different things, right? Diseases, pests, cultural requirements can vary among species. One type of bug may not attack another thing, so you need to know what you're dealing with, not only for the bug to be able to ID it, but the tree it's on. And is it going to be a problem for this tree, or is it something this tree can handle? No worries, right? You need to ability to ID trees requires basic knowledge, experience, practice, and exposure to woody landscape plants at different times of the year. It's easy to talk about what kind of tree it is when the leaves are all on, but when the leaves are all gone in the middle of winter, then you've got a couple of different things that you're going to need to know in order to identify that tree. You're going to need to know the bark. The bud scars will help. How it grows, the form of the tree itself, all those things will help you ID what tree you're dealing with. Let's see. So let's start by talking about taxonomy, okay, which is the plant classification. That's what taxonomy is plant classification. Anytime something's highlighted, underlined, mentioned 1,000 times, those might be things you want to underline in your own book and keep in your brain pan up there. It will probably pop up on a test. So just saying, when these presentations underline, bolden, or repeat multiple times, you're going to want to know that, okay? So we're going to go over that taxonomy. It's based on biological characteristics. It starts off with kingdom, which is either animal or plant. Well, obviously, with trees, we're dealing with plant, right? Then you have your division or your phylum, and it deals with vascular and non-vascular types. Below that, you have your subdivision of vascular, which is your angiosperms or gymnosperms, okay? And below that, you go into your class of angiosperm, which could either be dicotyledons or monocotyledons, and we'll get into that further in just a minute too. Then you have order and family below that, families with basically they have similar flowers and fruits, okay? Then you have your genus, which is very similar, especially in their reproductive structures. And then the last one is species, all right? And that's how the order goes for taxonomy, right? Now you say to yourself, how am I going to remember the order that all goes in? Well, there's a little formula to kind of help you out with that, okay? Kings play chess on fat gray stumps. Kingdom, phylum, right? Class. It goes on and on, but that's just a way to remember how they fall, all right? Kings play chess on fat gray stumps. All right, so getting back to the classification, like I said, in kingdom, we are dealing with plants for trees. Your division or phylum is non-vascular plants or vascular plants. All right, we're going to go over that now on the vascular plants. They are plants with a xylem and phloem, so they're moving things up and down underneath the bark, right? Angiosperms are plants with seeds covered by an ovary or fruit, all right? Flowering plants, their most deciduous trees are angiosperms and broad-leafed evergreens, all right? On the other hand, you have gymnosperms, which are plants with naked seeds. Did she say naked? Yes, I did. Naked seeds. They're cone-bearing plants, such as ginkgos and conifers, things like that. Okay, so gymnosperms, naked seeds, Angiosperms, they have an ovary or fruit. Just an easy way to remember that. Okay, for the phylum, you have gymnosperms, which, like we talked about, are conifers like juniper, cedar, and pine. The angiosperms basically is flowering plants, including most broadleaf evergreen species, or broadleaf tree species. Sorry, not evergreen. It can be, but yeah. So an angiosperm is flowering plants, all right? And the other ones, the gymnosperms, have conifers and cones, right? On the angiosperm classes, they further break down, all right? So in the angiosperm, we have the eudicotyledons, right? Eudicots means 2 seed leaves, right? It's also called dicotyledon. The new book changes that language a little bit and calls them eudicots. So it's still, dicotyledon's still in there, but it adds the EU on the front, okay? So dicotyledon, 2 seeds. Eudicotyledon, 2 seeds, 2 seed leaves. Most broadleaf species fall into that, and most common tree species, except for conifers, banana, and palms, okay? Different. They might be monocots, right? Monocotyledons are one seed leaf, right? They include grasses, lilies, orchids, and palm trees. They carry their vascular tissues in bundles as opposed to having that xylem and phloem, okay? And you remember Rob talked about all that on the first day of class, right? So classes themselves, you get into orders within the class, and then you have families, right? You have plants with the same family have common characteristics. They have the same type of flowers and the same type of fruits. In the genus, plants that are very closely related with similar characteristics, especially in their reproductive structures. And then in the species, that level basically identifies the plant. So the species name is a combination of the genus name and the specific epithet. Now, specific epithet means name, right? Notice that's underlined. You might want to remember that. A specific epithet is a name, and the species name is a combination of the genus name and that specific epithet. Okay? Plant classification going on. So we're taking this silver maple and we're going to break it down, right? So its kingdom is plant. Its phylum is angiosperm, okay? Its class is dicotyledon, right? Or eudicotyledon. Its order is sapindales. Its family is Aceraceae. Its genus is Acer, and its species is Saccharinium. So it's a silver maple. Acer Saccharinium is a silver maple, okay? That's how it works. For plant nomenclature, the naming of plants, common names, they can be confusing, misleading, and one species may have several different common names. Carpinius caroliniana is an American hornbeam in parts of the country. In other parts of the country, it's a blue beech. Out west, it's a musclewood because that muscly looking, structure on the, it just looks like muscles. Those trees are kind of muscly looking. So they call it musclewood out west, right? And it's got several different common names, but that plant nomenclature is always the same, no matter where you go. Carpinius caroliniana is always going to be that tree, no matter where you are, right? Tulip tree, that's Magnolia exoangelina, or is it a Liriodendron tulipifera? Different parts of the country, it may be either tree, right? But they all call it a tulip tree, right? Some people are thinking, oh, it's that pretty purple one. And some other people are thinking, oh, well, you must be talking about a tulip poplar, right? Well, you know which one you're talking about if you're using the actual scientific name as opposed to the common name. Other ones are really misleading, like Douglas fir. It's not a fir tree at all. It's actually in the pine family, okay? But it's called a Douglas fir in common name, right? The mountain ash, not an ash tree. It's actually in the rose family, right? So the common names can be really misleading. So it's really good as an arborist. And I know it takes a lot on some of these pronunciations. Believe me, I trip over them all the time. You'll hear me do it in this class. But we have the general gist of the subject, right? We know that it's going to be Carpinius caroliniana, and that sticks in your head that, yeah, that's an American hornbeam if I'm here in the South, right? Maybe it's, like I said, a musclewood somewhere else. But it's important to know those plant nomenclatures, okay? All right, common names, when you're writing them, should not be capitalized unless they include a proper name, and they should not be italicized. You might want to study this section because I know this comes up a lot. So you don't capitalize common names and you don't italicize common names unless they include a proper name. All right. Cultivar names like Betula nigra cully, okay, cully in quotation marks, that can't be trademarked, but the common name can be. So if it's a Betula nigra cully heritage river birch, that's the common name, heritage can be trademarked, but Betula nigra cully cannot. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? The trademark names are never written using single quotations. So it just comes out when you write it, just like it looks on your screen, Betula nigra heritage with the little copyright symbol, because heritage can be copyrighted, okay? So by botanical or scientific names, each plant has a unique botanical name. It's the same throughout the world. So sugar maple is an Acer sacrum. It's an Acer sacrum in, Australia. Good day, mate. How about that Acer sacrum? In Spain, it's the same thing. Hola. Whatever. It's an Acer sacrum wherever you go in the world, which is kind of cool, right? German arborists are calling this tree an Acer sacrum. Spanish arborists are calling this tree an Acer sacrum. And wherever you go, it's an Acer sacrum. Period. Right? So you don't have to get confused about what they may call that sugar maple over in their own country. All right. That's kind of cool. Hybrids. Hybrids occur. Hybrids are the result of crossbreeding between two different species, usually from the same genus. Okay? They're written with an X between the genus and the specific epithet, like Acer x freemani, Jeffers red. And that is a cross between that freemani and the Acer. And that gives you that beautiful Jeffers red tree, right? So that's what it ends up looking like. But it's actually a cross between two. We had something like that here in our cemetery, our historic cemetery, with we had a group of 10 arborists. Half of them said it was a scarlet oak. The other half said it was a southern red oak. But when we got to looking, it had leaf shape from both. It had characteristics of both. And what had happened was the big old scarlet oak that we have on the property had crossed with the southern red oak. And we got this beautiful tree. So it happens in nature. Yep. It's all fun. So species, there's a subspecies, and that's always written out as SSP, like you see it here. And the subspecies is a naturally occurring, closely related group within a species found in the same geographic range, but some distinct different characteristics. As an example, black maple is a subspecies of sugar maple. So it's very similar, but it has some distinct differences, right? So that's a subspecies within that species of tree. The form is always written out as F period or forma when it's plural. And it's similar to subspecies, but less distinct differences like white flowering dogwood versus red flowering dogwood. Okay, that would be a form. All right. Varieties written out as VAR period in the name is a subdivision of the species that has a trait distinctly different from the other plants within that species. And it naturally breeds true to that trait. All right. So a variety naturally breeds true to that trait. Okay. There's a difference between a variety and a cultivar. A cultivar, like Little Gem Magnolia, right, is a cultivated variety that requires human intervention or asexual propagation to reproduce a trait. So it's a genetically identical clone. All Little Gem Magnolias are clones of the first one. Okay, it takes us to do that, right? Where a variety occurs naturally and breeds true to that trait. Okay, so that's what I need you to keep in mind about varieties and cultivars. Okay, cultivar, man-made. Variety, nature-made. Okay. All right. Common names should not be capitalized, like I said earlier, unless they include a proper name, such as European, right? And they should not be italicized. Botanical names should be written with either underlined or italicized text. Italics is preferred. Examples of properly written botanical and common names are, and you can look at that list below, okay? There's your common name and your botanical name, all right, with each one beside it. Okay, so Magnolia grandiflora is a southern magnolia, right? That's how it works. And it's the same all over the world for that. Magnolia grandiflora. Beautiful trees.
Hey, Kay.
All right. Yeah.
So I do have a question, guys. Sorry, I missed it. Remember to drop your questions in the Q&A. That's where I see it the best. Somebody asked, and I may need clarification on this. They're kind of confused between VAR and SSP.
Let me go back up.
Thank you.
Okay, so the subspecies, the SSP, that's a naturally occurring, closely related group within a species found in the same geographic range. So that's the difference. It occurs within that same geographical area, right? It has some differences like black maple and sugar maple, but they're all found within the same little region, okay? Where the variety is a subdivision of a species that has a trait distinctly different from other plants within the species, and it always breeds true to that trait. So it has nothing to do with region, okay? Where the subspecies is going to be regional. So I hope that explains that a little bit better. I hope. So if not, let me know. But that's basically what you're dealing with, okay? It's within a range and within a geographic area for the subspecies. So you know you have sugar maple, and in that same region, you may have black maple, which is also a sugar maple, but with some distinct differences where that variety is the subdivision of a species that has a trait distinctly different from other plants within that species and naturally breeds true to that trait all the time, okay? All right, moving on. Let's see, where were we? Okay, the principles of woody plant ID is based on morphology, the size, shape, and appearance of the plants, right? Leaves and form are very useful in tree ID. Botanical classification is based on reproductive structures, so it deals with your flowers and your fruits. It used to do this woody plant ID, you're going to use form, bark, buds, twigs, leaves, flowers, fruit, and even scent. I know this sounds crazy, but back in my younger days when I was, out checking trees, I realized that young whips of tulip poplar, when you bend them, smell just like pepper. I don't know why that is, but I've always found that for me, that's what that smell is, right? It smells almost like a pepper. So when they're young and they don't have leaves on them, I can bend that whip and smell, and I'll know if it's a tulip poplar, right? So scent can be helped to use to ID trees as well. Sweet gums, if you crush that leaf, right, it has a very distinct, sweet, minty kind of smell. And that helps you ID that if you didn't know that 5-leaf point was sweet gum. You'd figure that out if you crush it up because maple doesn't smell the same, right? Anyway, some important tree characteristics, like I talked about, your form. How does it grow? Is it pyramidical? Is it shaped like a lollipop? Different trees grow in different ways. Your branching habit. So some trees reach out and all the branch tips reach up, right? Others curl down. Some have a mixture of both. They curl down at the bottom and then reach up as they're going to the top, right? So branching habits can tell you something and help identify it. Leaves, of course, your leaves can help. They've got leaf margins, a leaf base, the leaf apex, whether they're hairy or not. All those things can help you identify what tree you're dealing with. The buds themselves, when they start and break on the branch, they're shaped differently. Where they come out at on the branch is different. That can help you ID them. The twigs themselves, the pith inside the twigs. Some trees have a distinct pith pattern, right? Which is the interior pulp of that twig. it looks a certain way in certain trees. Obviously, the bark is different on different trees. Flowers are different on different trees. Fruits, some have them, some don't. So all these things help you in identifying your tree and learning those characteristics of each class or each species. ID at a glance. So when you're at a distance, the first thing you can notice is the form, right? Its branching characteristics, its growth habitat. Like I said, is it pyramidal? Is it lollipop shape? Elms always have that beautiful vase shape, right? Sugar maples have that gorgeous, brilliant fall color, right? Live oak has that beautiful spreading habitat. And depending on where you are, it probably has Spanish moss on it. I say depending on where you are because we have these beautiful live oaks up here in the Piedmont area in Georgia, and they don't have Spanish moss because it can't survive here. It's not humid enough for it, right? But go further south or toward the coast, and all those live oaks are going to have Spanish moss because it can survive in that area. So don't always use that Spanish moss as an indicator. But you can use the form of that tree is amazing. How it comes out, dips down, and just keeps going. Yes.
So we'll probably go into this much more when Rob comes in to talk about pruning, but a good time to ask, can branching habit change with pruning?
Yeah, I mean, you could prune a tree. I mean, you could try and prune a tree in any shape you want, but its natural shape, it's going to keep popping out leaves and branches. And if it's pruned incorrectly, you're going to end up, doing the tree in. If you're trying to make a beautiful lollipop shaped tree and change that into pyramidal, yeah, can you do it? Yeah, you can prune it that way. Is it going to survive? Probably not. So really, it's key to know what your tree looks like now when it's little, and you have to be able to explain to your clients what it's going to look like in full form, because it's not easy to change the form of trees. Can it be done? Sure, it can be done. They can be espalated. They can, you can do all kinds of things with pruning. I've seen a guy take an apple tree and make a fence out of it, a series of apple trees. He grew all the branches together and made a fence, and they still produced fruit. But the tree's habit is what it is in branching. He already had to remove that fence. It started to fall apart. Yeah. So can you do it? Yes. Should you do it? Depends on what you're trying to do overall. Best thing is to pick the right tree for the right place, in my opinion. And we'll go from there. Anyway, I hope that answered that. And Rob will get into pruning more when he talks about that. All right. So talking about the form and branching characteristics and growth habits of the trees. Like I said, the elms are usually vase-shaped. Sugar maples have that fall color, and the live oaks have that spreading, and maybe Spanish moss, depending on where you are. So the tree forms, let's talk about that a little. All right. So on the left is that beautiful live oak that I'm talking about, right? That spreading, and I mean, they're just amazing to see in the forms they grow in. So if we look at these two pictures, X current and D current, with this beautiful oak tree, what classification would we put that in? Is it X current, where it kind of goes straight up and straight down? No, it's a D current. Those branches kind of spread everywhere, right? And it kind of helps me. I know this sounds nutty, but if you had a tree that had a lightning strike on an X current tree, it would go straight, the current would go straight down to the ground. So X current would go straight down. On a D current tree, if lightning hit that tree, it would bounce all over because of all those multiple branches, right? It's a D currented tree. That's how I keep it straight in my head. Anyway, if that helps anybody, great. But that's the two forms basically for tree form. You have X current and D current to start off with, right? Straight up and down trunk, or multiple branched, like these oaks. Okay. Your leaf arrangement. A leaf is determined by the presence of a bud where it attaches to the stem. Okay. So a simple leaf is a single one part, one blade or needle, etc., leaf that is not subdivided into little leaflets, right? A compound leaf is two or more little leaflets, but only a single bud or cluster of buds at the base of that little petiole. And if you're not familiar with leaf structure, like what is a petiole, we'll get into that in a minute, but you really need to look at this because some of those questions may pop up on the test as to what are the parts of the leaf. Okay, that's why it's in this chapter. They're kind of kind of important for figuring out what tree you're dealing with. Leaves are arranged differently. So you may have an opposite attachment on the twig. So the opposite on the left, you'll see the petioles come off at the same place, right? Opposite each other on the twig. And a simple leaf, like I said, is one leaf per bud, right? So you've got these big one leaf, these are maple leaves on the simples. Alternate attachment, they don't come off equally. They come off every other, right? So they're coming off at separate junctions from that twig. They're not joined right across from each other. And compound leaves, this is what they look like. So this is a walnut, and it's got compound leaves. You see the petiole where it attaches to the branch, and off of that come all these little leaflets, right? So that's kind of how you're dealing with leaf arrangement on the actual twigs or branches themselves. Okay, simple and compound. Are they opposite or alternate? Leaf and bud arrangement. All right, so this is pretty simple to remember. Opposites, there's only four of them really. You have maple, ash, dogwood, and horse chestnut. Those are all opposite leaf attachments, right? Alternates are most other species. Almost everybody else is alternate, but those four. And you can remember them by keeping mad horse in mind. Mad horse, maple, ash, dogwood, and horse chestnut. Okay, those are going to be opposite. Okay. We try and use these little tricks to help you remember stuff. I know it's helped me in my career. So my mad horse trees are trees with opposite leaf arrangement. Like I just said, maple, ash, dogwood, or horse chestnut. Here's what they look like. So you got a maple up here on the left. To the right, you have an ash tree leaf with the little leaflets. On the left, you have the beautiful bearing dogwood. And then on the right, you have the little horse chestnut leaves, right, that come off. So that's what they look like. And as you can see on the brackets on the top right picture, the ash tree, you can see that those leaflets are attached to the petiole on opposite sides of the twig, okay, where they come out. All right, conifer needles and their arrangements. They can tell you a lot about who they are too. All right, so conifers are cone-bearing trees, right? Conifers are cone-bearing trees. Pines or pinus have needles arranged in clusters. They're either 2, 3, or 5 of those little needles coming off in each arrangement, right? 2, 3, or 5, that tells you it's a pine. Spruce, picea, or fir, aves, produce needles singularly. They're not in bundles, right? They're not in clusters. They're produced singly off that branch. They're sharp, they're short, they're single, and they're square, all right? The Christmas tree, think of that. You know, you got to hang your ornaments on there and ow, they stab you, right? And they do not come off in these little clusters like the pine trees do, right? Other conifers may have all-like or scale-like foliage like the thugia. And that's what that picture is at the bottom. See how they kind of attach right on top of each other. They always remind me of a dragon scale. And that's how I keep them in my head, you know, for those all-like or scale-like foliage. It's a good way to remember that. On leaf morphology, let's talk a little bit about simple leaves. So here's what I was talking about, the kind of breakdown of what the different parts of the leaf are. Okay, so you have the apex at the top of the leaf, right? The margin is the sides, the base where it attaches, right, to the petiole, which goes to the branch, right? And then the big half is called the blade, right? So you have a blade on each side on this particular populus deltoids, right? Poplar tree, all right? So keep that in mind. That's how it works. Apex, margin, base, petiole, where it attaches to the branch or the twig, and then each half is a blade, right, on either side of that main vein. Your leaf margin, remember where that was? Yeah, on the side. Okay. Your leaf margin can be a lot of different shapes. It can be entire, it can be serrate, and within serrate, you have serrate, double serrate, dentate, crenate, undulate, and lobed. So it can have all these different characteristics. right? Who can think of a lobed leaf tree? Anybody? Well, if you said oak or white oak, you're right. All right, has that kind of lobed shape. So anyway, that's the leaf margin. And then you have your leaf base, okay? And they can be different too. They can be acute, rounded, cordate, oblique, articulate. They can be any of these shapes, right, at the base. So that will help you ID the tree because different trees have different leaf bases. Just kind of familiarize yourself with that. Leaf morphology, the shape of the leaf can tell you a lot, right? They can be linear, like a willow oak, right? They can be oval, oblong, ovate, obovate, deltoid, cordate, elliptical, lanceolate. There are all types of different leaf shapes for these broadleaf trees, and they all will help you identify the tree. In the conifers, again, like we talked about, you know if it's a needle-like and it is in bundles of 2, 3, or 5, you're going to be dealing with a pine tree, right? If it's all like, you're probably dealing with something like a fir. And if it's scale-like, you might be looking at a thuja, right? So just keep that in mind. Shapes can help ID. Your leaf apex, right, at the top, it could be acumate, acute, obtuse, truncated, or cuspidated. Now, it doesn't have a picture of a cuspidate tree leaf, but can you imagine what cuspid, what does that sound like? Like a tooth, right? A cuspid? That might tell you the shape of that tip or that apex. But just keep in mind, different shapes are going to help you ID that tree on the base and the apex. Morphology and compound leaves. All right, a lot of people ask questions about this all the time. So let's see if we can help clear this up. So on the left, you have your compound leaflet, right? Within that compound leaflet, you have your primary leaflet, right? You see that area? And then your pinnule or pinnula is your secondary leaflet. You have a rachis that they all attach to that goes down to the petiole that then attaches to the twig, right? So petiole at the bottom, then you have your rachis once your leaflets start coming off, right? And you have a secondary pinnule or pinnula that comes off of that, right? That is a compound leaflet, okay? That hopefully that makes sense to everybody. That is a bipinnate leaf. So you have leaflets coming off on either side, right, of the rachis where it attaches to the petiole. If you're looking at your palmately compound leaf, palmate, what shape? Yeah, like the palm of your hand, right? It spreads out. And on that, the petiole, each one of those little leaflets comes off in a palm shape from your petiole, okay? So that's how you remember a palmately compound leaf. On the even pinnate leaf, the next picture down, you have your petiole at the bottom. You have your leaflets or pinnas that come directly off that petiole. And at the very top, you have your rachis, right? That's where all the little leaflets attach to. And then it attaches to the petiole and goes back to the twig. Okay, so I hope that helps in how you determine whether it's a pinnate leaf, palmately compound leaf, or an even pinnate leaf, right? All right, moving along. Okay, so for compound leaves, here's a couple of different varieties. You have a buckeye. What shape would that fan out to? Yeah, if you think in palmate, you're correct. Okay, your honey locust on the left, that's going to be, more of that long petiole, right? And coming off bipinnately, right? And then at the bottom, you've got your hickory, right? So they're coming off of a rachis, right? In the bottom. So that hickory would fall into probably the even pinnate. So anyway, that's how you work that, right? That's how you figure that out. Simple versus compound. This is right out of your textbook, okay? So there's your diagram of how a simple leaf looks on the left, right? The stem, you have your bud where the petiole comes off, right? The petiole attaches to the midrib, and then you have the blade and the entire leaf. On a compound leaf, you've got your stem, you've got where the bud comes off the stem, then you've got the petiole, which attaches to a petiole, right? And then the leaflets come off the petiole, okay? So a compound leaf has 2 or more leaflets, but only a single bud or cluster of buds at the base of that petiole, where a simple leaf is a single, one part, one blade, needle, etc. leaf that is not subdivided into little leaflets. Okay? Makes it easy. When you can see a diagram, that helps me remember a lot better. But study up on this because you may see those questions pop up. Okay? Leaf characteristics. Here we have 2 leaves, right? 2 sets of leaves. Let's see, on the left, what is that leaf telling us? All right, so if we look at that, it's shiny, right? It looks thick and waxy, okay? It kind of has a different shape with little kind of spikes along the edge. And if you said that was some kind of holly maybe, or a oak variety, holly oak, something, you're probably going along the right line of thinking. Where on the right, you've got, that's a unique thing. It's got more than one leaf shape, doesn't it? Okay, let's see. It's got one like a mitten. It's got one like a just regular leaf, broadleaf, right? And then one that's split out in 3. So if you guessed this was a sassafras, you'd probably be correct. It's got 3 different leaf types. Hey, you.
Hey, me again. Why is honey locust bipinnate? I would think it is a pinnate compound.
Let's see. Did I goof? It happens. Honey locust? Oh, you're right, bipinnate. Well, let's go back and look. It's hard to tell in the picture, but it looks like they're coming off. Are there multiples coming off each one? Or are they even pinnates? What do you think, class? It's hard to tell in this picture.
Yeah, y'all are welcome to drop it in the chat if you have an opinion.
Yeah.
I've got even. Anybody else?
Yep.
Even.
Like I said, I'd say it's even because you're not getting the bipinnate, so you're not getting 2 coming off of each petiole, right? With a secondary rachis. You've only got an even 1 petiole, and then the leaflets coming off of that. Look close on that picture.
Yeah,
okay?
I think everybody's saying even. Thanks. That was a fun
Yeah.
one.
Okay. So, hey, you're doing it. You're doing it right. I love it. Okay. So getting back down to our, knowing this about sassafras trees, and mulberries can do this too, have 3 leaf shapes. So you'd need more than just this to figure out what tree this is, but there's a reason that the leaves are like that, and they just are on those 2 types of trees, mulberry and sassafras, that they have 3 different distinct leaf shapes on the same tree. There's some old Native American stories about how that happened. And if we have time, I'll tell you later. But I want to get through this chapter first so that we can get through all the chapters that we have to do today. All right, here's another one. Let's look at this one. Kind of reminds me of a palm. Yeah, palmate, right? And that lovely tree is a type of magnolia. So, yeah, that grows here, grows native. So, beautiful tree. Deciduous trees. Now, in the winter, you're going to need to be familiar with more than just your leaves on a deciduous tree because they're not going to be there. And yeah, there may be leaves on the ground, but are they from that tree? I mean, if it's the only tree in a 100-mile radius, it might be a safe bet to say, yeah, these are the leaves that fell off this tree. But in most places, you're going to have multiple leaves on the ground, and it's you better know more than your leaf shape, okay? So you're going to need to know what the bark looks like, what its branching habit is, sorry. The twigs, what do they look like? What do the buds look like? Is there fruit? Is there not fruit? Does it have pitch? Pitch doesn't come out on everything, so that is a big indicator of what you're dealing with, right? So let's look a little bit at that winter bud morphology. Okay. On a green ash tree, this is kind of what it looks like. And they always remind me of those little hunter's hats, with the little brim that folds and the ear flaps tied up. That's what these things look. It's an Elmer Fudd. That's what it is. It's an Elmer Fudd bud on the green ash. Anyway, it's at the very top is your terminal bud. All right. And below that, you have the scales that come off of the terminal bud at the very end of a twig, right? Because you don't have leaves, but all these little lateral buds are going to be next year's leaves, right, that pop out, or next year's twigs that come off. And that terminal bud is going to open up and grow into new leaves, right? And more trees. The tree keeps growing. And that's what it looks like. They have little tiny lenticels that some trees you can see them, some you can't. There are nodes in between, right? Each growth period, right? And then at the bottom, you see that pith, and that may be a different shape as well. But all these little winter things, the bundle trace scar from where the leaf fell off right under the bud, that can help you ID the tree in winter. But if you're like me, if you see this green ash with its Elmer Fudd hat, you'll know that's a green ash from now on, right, in the winter. So that helps you. That winter bud morphology really helps out. Take a good look at that and try and remember what each thing is so that you can ID it better. Palms. Oh boy. Palms are interesting. There's more than 1,000 of these species. There's more than 200 genera. They're native to all continents except Antarctica. A bit too chilly for them there. Most are single stem, but some are multi-stem, right? Some are shrubby, others are kind of vine-like, and some can grow to 200 feet tall or more. Most palm leaves or fronds are compound, and they're either palmate, like we talked about, or pinnate. Now, the pinnate on the right in this photograph, it always reminds me of a pin feather, right? A duck's pin feather or a goose. And that's kind of how I remember that shape, right? It's a pinnate, right? That'll help you ID that a little bit. Tree identification keys. Well, these were books, basically, step-by-step methods for identifying plants. They describe the shape, the texture, the arrangement of leaves, the bud characteristics, the twig shape, the morphology of the flowers and fruits, and it kind of works it all out in this flow chart with these questions at the end, like those adventure books, right? Will you turn left to go down the path toward the beautiful castle or right towards the swamp? Yes or no? And then if it's there, you go to the next thing, right? Well, that's what this tree identification keys do as well. It's kind of a flow chart. Does it have pinnate leaf? Yes, turn to page 6. No, turn to page 124. That kind of thing. So it's a flow chart in a book requiring a yes or no answer, okay? Identification keys is kind of what it looks like on a page for a dicotyledon sorry. And it tells you plant in flower, leaves absent. If they are, then go to key 2, right? So you're flipping pages and answering yes or no questions to try and figure out what tree this is. And there's a lot of these keys out there. They're kind of regional, but that's how you use them. And that's kind of what it looks like. They need a certain understanding of the level of expertise. So you need to know what it's talking about when it asks you if it's pinnate or palmate, if it's, dicotyledon or monocotyledon, that kind of thing, to ID the plants correctly. The plant may not match its written characteristics exactly because of the season and in differences in plants, their color and morphology. So different times of the year, they're going to look different too. So it's difficult to use these older key books. Not all keys have all the trees that might be found in a given region. They may not have put them all in there. It's only as good as the information that somebody put into it. It's got genetic variability, plant condition, location, and the environment. All that can affect the size of the plant parts. When trees are young, they tend to put out giant leaves. Why? Because they're under the canopy of everybody else, right? So they got to make that leaf as big as they can to try and get enough to make food, right? But as the tree gets older and taller, that leaf shrinks in size. So that key doesn't take all that into consideration. But you, as an arborist, are going to have to think about those kind of things. Luckily, nowadays, we do have a lot of good plant ID help online, but sometimes it's good to start with old school to make sure you're getting all this right. And then using those keys is even faster, So keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to take a 5-minute, not a 15-minute break. Okay. Just get your head around something, grab another cup of coffee, whatever. Run to the restroom if you've already had too much coffee.
All right, back at 10:10, guys and gals.
Right. And I'll set up the next one. Let's see. Okay.
All right, everybody. It's 10:10. I hope everybody's back at their seat. Miss K, are you back at your seat? You're late. I like to give Kay a hard time, guys. Yeah, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Coffee took a little longer than I thought.
No, it just turned 10:11. You didn't quite make it late. I was just giving you a hard time.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. I needed more coffee. I don't know about the rest of you. Okay, let's roll on into soil science. Whoop. I love this chapter. I know I'm one of those soil nuts. All right, so we're going to talk about some soil. Big thing trees need. Soil science. So soil texture and structure, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about porosity and water movement. We're going to talk about soil pH, cation exchange and capacity, and then buffering capacity. What's a cation? We'll go over all that. All right. We're going to go over the rhizosphere, soil organisms, and organic matter. Soil moisture and absorption of essential elements, all critical for trees. Gravitational water, field capacity, permanent wilting points, and the infiltration rate. Okay, we're going to talk about all that lovely stuff. So the first thing you need to know is that trees and soils are completely ecologically interdependent. Lousy soil, trees in bad shape. Trees doing good, soil's probably in better shape. They work together, right? Urban development processes disrupt that ecological balance between trees and the soils they're in. Most tree decline can be directly attributed to soil stress of one situation or another, right? Most tree decline can be attributed to soil stress. The health of the soil and the soil-tree relationship has a major influence on tree health and the tree's overall performance. Okay? Trees in the situation you see on the right are doomed 9 times out of 10. You've severed that structural root pan, right? The tree is not going to be able to hold itself up structurally. And you've basically cut all the absorbing roots on the entire left side of that tree. So now we're in a fight for our life, basically. Okay? And may or may not make it. It depends. And I've always said you can't say definitively, yes or no, this won't make it. There's a bunch of factors involved. But typically when you get that kind of damage, it may take it 5 to 6 years, but the tree will eventually succumb. But I've seen ones recover. Anyway, it's all dependent on that soil. The soil ecosystem itself is a substrate of rocks, sand, clay, and organic matter. They anchor the roots and provide water and minerals to the tree. Also, there's an ecosystem there, and it's inhabited by insects, earthworms, nematodes, fungi, bacteria, and all these other microbes, each with a function and living together in a very delicate balance in that soil. On the left is the mycorrhizae that come off, right? The fungus bodies. And worms, they move through the soil. They're creating space. They're pooping out stuff. It makes all these wonderful nutrients for the trees. And it just, it has to have that. And if one or the other, or all these things get displaced, missed, smashed by compaction, it no longer functions, right? The tree can't function either when that doesn't function. So its physical properties in the soil, native soils basically result from hundreds to millions of years of biological, chemical, and physical weathering of its parent material or underlying bedrock. That's what parent material is in soil. It's the bedrock, right? Keep that in mind. Soil characteristics are determined by the geology of that soil parent material. So here in the Piedmont region, we have a underlying bedrock of, anybody want to take a guess? Well, if you said granite, you're right. Okay, we are a granite plate here. And that's going to be our parent material, or that D horizon. The soil is listed in kind of these profiles, right? So at the very top, you have your horizon that is organic, right? That's your topsoil layer. And then below that is a B horizon, which is a subsoil. It's kind of some of that organic layer mixing down with the stuff that's coming up from the parent material at the bottom, the D horizon. And as it breaks up, it goes into the C horizon and is kind of weathered parent material. Then it all kind of mixes together in that B layer, the subsoil, right? So you have movement coming down from the top and movement coming up from the bottom. And all together, that makes your soil profile, right? Hope that explained it fairly well. Your soil ecology varies by your geographic location, your climate, your underlying geology, and of types of plants that are present. Okay? Each area is going to have a soil survey. All right, this is the one from our region, which is DeKalb County. Most of the counties in Georgia have a soil survey, and it kind of tells you what it is. So in the northwest corner, we have a lot of rock. The Piedmont area, we've got clays, sand, loam, you name it, rock. And then the coastal plains, it gets more and more sandy soil, loamy mix. And as you go out to the coast, it turns into pure sand, right? So, and all these soils react differently to weather, rain amounts. Some of them hold water better than others. We'll go into all that. But those guides kind of help you know what's around you. Especially if you're in a new area, I suggest you get one of those so that you know. Excuse me. The soil development and composition comes from the bedrock, okay? Sediment gets deposited along waterways. By volume, an ideal soil for trees is composed of, right? You may need to write this down or highlight it, all right? An ideal soil volume is composed of 45% mineral solids, that would be sand, silt, and clay. So 45% sand, silt, and clay that originate from that parent material rock. 5% organic matter, including the little organisms that live in it, right? And then 50% pore space that needs to be filled with either air or water. Why is that critical? We'll talk about that in a minute. But remember that mix, 45% mineral solids, 5% organic matter, and 50% pore space. Okay. Ideal soil. Soil horizons form over time, right? They're visible layers. If you go in any construction site where they've dug down, first started digging out, this picture on the right is what you'll see. It looks layered. You know, you drive out west, you'll see this all the time where they cut the highways through. You can still see the layers in that soil, right? The horizons develop as a result of rainfall, leaching, heating and cooling, chemical reactions, biological activities, and the accumulation of different elements and materials. So at the top, you can see that dark brown layer. That's that organic layer. That stuff's lovely with all the activity, and that kind of blends into that next substrate layer, right? B horizon, and then it goes down, and you can see at the very bottom, you have rock, right? That's your bottom layer. And some places have more of the organic layer than others. You know, here in the Piedmont, we lost a bunch of ours due to bad farming practices. And so if we find an inch of topsoil here, you're really seeing something. 2 inches, you're in an area that hadn't been touched in quite some time, okay? Midwest, man, you may have a foot or more of topsoil, right? That beautiful black dirt. We don't have that here. I wish we did. We don't, but our trees survive. Anyway, I digress, so we'll keep going. The soil profile is the nature, arrangement, depth, and number of horizons found. That is your soil profile, okay? It usually consists of at least 5 major horizons. Like I said, O for the organic layer, right? That's your impact on biological characteristics of the soil. A, along with O, contain the most fine absorbing roots. Might want to make note of that. A, along with O, in the soil profile, contain the most fine absorbing roots of trees, and it is very biologically active. The B zone of accumulation, where materials that have leached from the surface kind of mix with that parent material. C is the deepest layer just above the bedrock, and it's composed of partially weathered parent material, right? It continually forming through physical, chemical, biological weathering of that parent material. And of course, R is our bedrock layer, our parent material. Now, how are you going to keep all those layers in your head? Well, there's another thing for that. Just remember, organic agitators blend crumbled rock. The O layer, the A layer, the B layer, the C layer, the R layer, right? Organic agitators blend crumbled rock. It even kind of helps you remember what each one does. So make note of that. You might need to know these layers, right? And their characteristics. So here's a little quick chart of the soil profile and how it works with trees, right? So you see your O horizon up there on the left side, lists out your horizons. In your O layer, that's where your transformation of carbon and organic materials such as soil amendments, and that changes into humus or humus, a stable organic material that builds healthy soils, right? Humus formation sustains soil organism activities, and that's needed to support healthy plant populations. So that's where most of your root activity is. And they also go down into that A layer, right? That's your soil aggregation happens in that layer. Here, soil organic matter and stable organo-mineral complexes form, which bind and store carbon. Okay. Deep rooting action really encourages root growth and enhances organic carbon in the subsoil. Right? So we want our trees to be able to get down as far as they can. And so it kind of moves down. You get translocation, right? From the trees and all the little organisms moving together, moving stuff down. And from the bottom, you're coming up as that bedrock breaks up, right? From pressure and everything else. So that's kind of how it goes. Okay. Just kind of study that chart at your own leisure. The organic layer. All right. Does anybody know what that left picture is? That's a little fun thing that happens. We get it a lot here in the winter. It's called frost heave. So all the water in the soil freezes and pushes upward. So it lifts the soil up. You can see little soil particles trapped at the end of those ice crystals. And then as it melts, it, shrinks back down again, right? That is your organic matter layer. And it has things in it in the O layer like leaves, twigs, bark, organisms. It's also known as the litter layer in the organic layer. It's very active biologically. It contains dead plant and animal material in various stages of decomposition. If you've been playing in the dirt, you know exactly what's in that stuff. It shrinks and swells, like I said, with changes in moisture content and temperature, frost heave, and then you get shrinking and cracking as it gets hot in the summer, especially if you got clay soils, it'll shrink up. Those clay particles are very small and then they crack like a broken pot, right? So that all changes the soil as it's shrinking and swelling. That organic matter helps to bind those soil particles together to form larger aggregates. So an aggregate is what? It's a larger soil particle. All right. And it improves soil structure. It serves as a food or carbon source for soil organisms. Growth and movement of organisms through that soil, it improves the aeration and fertility and structure of the soil itself. Okay? Root growth, let's face it, roots grow where the soil conditions are good. Roots require space, organic matters, essential mineral elements, adequate oxygen, and water. Okay, fine absorbing roots, and I mean fine, reach up and feel your hair. That's how these guys are. They're that small, right? They're the ones that absorb that water and nutrient, and they're found in the upper 6 to 10 inches of soil. Okay? Very few roots grow deeper than 3 to 4 feet. People have this idea that a taproot's going to go, 10, 20 feet down into the soil, but that's not really the case. It's not how they work, okay? So few roots grow further than 3 to 4 feet. And trees can develop much deeper root systems, but it depends on the species and the environmental conditions, right? So someplace you have lots of depth of topsoil, yeah, you might get feet of soil that are, 10 feet, but most regions don't have that. So remember what I said about those fine absorbing roots, right? They're looking for what? Space, oxygen, water, nutrients in the soil. Well, in the South, when you have a busted clay terracotta sewer pipe, well, that is the perfect place to find space, water, air, and nutrients when you're a tree. So that's what happened here. That's that picture. I love this. A plumber had a call. The people's toilets kept backing up. The sinks were backing up. It was a nightmare. Well, when we finally got out there and excavated the whole thing, they found so many of these advantageous little roots, absorbing roots, that it actually clogged the entire pipe. So he cut that out and took a picture for me. So really cool little thing. But that shows you how small they are and how prolific they are when they find something they need. They kind of push into that area, right? Ooh, I've got water, nutrients, air, and everything I need right here. Yuck. But hey, they love it. All right. The soil texture, all right, that's the relative fineness or coarseness of the inorganic mineral soil particles, and that is called soil texture, right? So it's the fineness or coarseness of the inorganic mineral soil particles, soil texture. Fineness or coarseness depends on the relative proportions of sand, silt, clay in that mix, right? Sand particles are relatively large. You know this if you've been to the beach and gotten them stuck in places. Silt particles are intermediate in size, and clay are the smallest particles of all. So here's a little chart that tells you got gravel, looks giant, right, over on the left. And then you go down to clay. And at that particular scale, clay is so small, it's almost invisible, right? Kind of cool, right? Excuse me. But that's your soil texture, right? It deals with all those little particles. The textural classes are determined by the relative amounts of each of the three particle types. So loam is a mix of the three different particle sizes and is considered the ideal soil. So if I asked you, what is the ideal soil? It's a loam, right? A mix of the three different particle sizes. It contains relatively less clay in a loam. Okay. That's kind of what it looks like, that beautiful loam. So we're going to go over the soil triangle. This also might show up on a test, just so you know. All right. And so if I asked you what type of soil is 30% clay, so find your percentage of clay on the left of the triangle, and 20% silt. Now find your 20% of silt on the right-hand side of the triangle, and 50% sand. Oops. Oh my gosh, what happened? Sorry, I must have hit the wrong button. Oh, yikes. Let me go back down. My apologies. It's another one of those fun days. All right. There we were on the triangle. Okay. Sorry about that. And now, of course, it's not going full screen. Great. What happened? All right. There we go. Now we're back at full screen. Sorry about that. Go down and look at 50% sand. So at the bottom of the chart, find your 50%. And where all three meet, where that arrow just happens to be pointing, tells you that that mixture is a sandy clay loam. Okay. That's how the soil triangle works. Everybody got that? All right, good. Let's move on. So soil texture and structure. Soil structure and texture determines a soil's ability to hold water and provide oxygen to the roots. Makes sense, right? It has a profound influence on the chemical and biological properties of the soil. Texture determines which species of trees will do well in a given site. So if I take this cactus palm variety on the right and try and transplant it into the swamp, it is going to die. It's not used to that texture of soil, right? Same thing for that, bald cypress on the left. If I try and put it out in the desert, it's not going to survive. It's not going to know what to do with that soil texture, right? So makes a difference, right? Soil structure, you're talking about 50% of the soil is space, right? Or pores between the soil particles. So you have different size pores, right? You have macropores, which are large spaces between the aggregates of soil, and they can hold water against gravity. Once drained, they hold air, right? Micropores, the little ones, retain water and are the source of available water to plants between rainfall. So you might be asking, Kay, why in the world do you have a picture of a straw on this page? Well, you got to think of trees just that way, right? You look at the left picture with that beautiful root system, which you'll notice is bigger than the top, right? They all are little straws. Trees are straws. They stick those little tiny, tiny fine roots into the soil. They go into these macro and micropores. They move through the air space looking for water trapped in the micropores. And then they suck up that water, right? And at the top, they transpire out what they don't need. They make the sugars in the leaf. And then they send it all back down through that same water channel back to the roots. So they're constantly drawing water up and down, just like a straw. Now, what happens if you crush that soil and you crush those pore spaces? Put your finger over the end of that straw. That's what you've just done. So it can no longer draw water and nutrients up, and it can't send sugars back down, right? So that's how you kind of have to think of these guys. And that's why the soil, those spaces that hold not only water, but air are so critical, because if I can't draw air, I can't draw water, right? So keep in mind, macropores are the large spaces between the aggregates. They cannot hold water against gravity. It passes through them, but they hold that critical air, right? While the micropores do their job, they're tight, and they can hold on to that water against gravity. And that's where the plant gets their water, it draws. But they have to work together. No airspace, I can't draw. This is why cypress trees put up those knees. What are they pulling through those knees? Oxygen, right? In those periods when the soil is flooded. Trees are pretty darn smart. Anyway. All right. So in the soil structure, chemical and physical changes and soil organism activity cause soil particles to be grouped or clumped together. Those clumps are called soil aggregates, right? The size, shape, and strength and arrangement of the soil aggregates form that soil structure. Root growth, freezing and thawing, and burrowing insects and other little animals all affect the structure of that soil. The size and shape of those soil aggregates and soil texture influence the amount of macropores and micropore space in the soil. Coarse soils like sand, they're dominated by macropores, right? Fine soils like clays are dominated by micropores, right? So the best conditions for plants are really a balance between micro and macropores, right? A well-aggregated structural soil facilitates aeration and water movement. So you can't just have clay and you can't just have sand, because you're not going to be able to hold water, right, with just the sand. And with the clay, all you're going to have is water, especially if it's compacted. So you need that mixture for water and air to work together. Bulk density. You may have heard of this, especially on construction sites. What is bulk density? Well, it's the mass or weight of dried soil per unit of undisturbed soil volume. Okay, that's bulk density. It's the mass or weight of dried soil per unit of undisturbed soil volume. So the lower a bulk density means lower weight, means more pore space. Okay. Higher bulk density means it's a higher weight and it has less pore space, right? Soil compaction increases that bulk density and decreases the soil space. That's why it's so bad for tree roots and trees in general. Soil compaction, basically, soils vary in their susceptibility to compaction based on their texture. Okay. Soil compaction destroys the soil aggregates and reduces those pore spaces, right? So soils with a high percent of clay are much more easily compactable than soils with sand, right? Soils with a high moisture content are also more easily compacted, right? The dried soil kind of stays together and it's bonded. When it's wet, it just squishes, right? Like mud, you can just squish that stuff right together, right? So compacted soils restrict the root growth of a tree. They reduce the water infiltration and availability, right? They limit movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the root zone. They limit biological components of reducing large pores required by larger organisms, so the worms can't move through the soil either, right? And the development of soil surface crusts and inhibits the water from being able to get through there and for the trees to be able to release, do what they do in the soil. So it stops a gas exchange and it stops water infiltration. If you've ever seen a crust of dried mud, it cracks eventually because it's like a clay pot, Nothing gets through there. Gas doesn't get through there, air doesn't get through there, and water certainly doesn't get through. So compacted soils are just bad. All right, so here's some examples of that lovely compaction that happens during construction. How do you think these two trees, which were save trees at the top picture, are going to do now that we've had all this work, compaction, and all that stuff done on top of them? Believe it or not, one of these trees actually survived with prescriptive measures. The other one, unfortunately, succumbed. And this particular individual had to pay a lot of money, but that doesn't put the tree back. They had to plant new trees instead. The idea with this is to save trees. But maybe with as close as that one tree is to this new house, that shouldn't have been a save tree to start with, right? These are all things we have to think about as arborists, right? Those soils make a difference. These soils have been compacted and they've been contaminated with everything else that's sitting there. The picture on the lower left is an area where a developer came in and cleared and then placed all of his stockpile dirt on top of this tree that was a save tree. Now, he got tickets and all that kind of stuff. And he said, well, I fixed it. I took all the dirt off the tree. That's what was left after he removed all the dirt off the tree that you see where there's still dirt on the tree, right? But he didn't do anything to decompact the soils. And the picture on the right is what occurred due to the compaction of that tree. It's a species known as Quercus horizontali. Yeah, the tree fell down because the roots were crushed. The space in the soil was crushed. I could no longer draw water and nutrients as a tree with with compacted soils and no space in the soil anymore. Okay. And once it's down, there's no putting it back up, right? So just keep that in mind. That's how critical the soil is to these trees. Now, there's a thing that you can get a hold of. It's pretty cheap, called a compaction tester, right? So when the needle is in the red zone, that soil is compacted. You can't even push the probe down in through it. If it's starting to get compacted, it hits in that yellow zone. And if it's good, it goes right in and your needle stays in the green zone. That's what you want. But that tells it real quick when you're out on a site trying to figure out what's wrong with the tree that's succumbing. You can do these compaction testers and show your client right away, oh my gosh, this tree is compacted. No wonder it's starting to fail. It has no space in the soil anymore. And there are things that you can do to fix that. But this is just a good tool to have in your arsenal. Let's talk about the soil chemical properties. pH. Everybody hears about pH, especially if you like plants, right? A soil with a slightly acidic pH of 6.0 to 6.5 is generally favorable for most plants. Okay. The range goes from 0 to 14, 14 being more alkaline, right? The most alkaline. The pH scale is logarithmic. Okay, so a pH of 6 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 7. Okay, 10 times. So if we asked how much more acidic is a pH of 5 than 7, yeah, the answer is 100. Yeah, it's 100 times more. Okay, it's logarithmic. The pH scale is logarithmic. Keep that in mind. Okay, soil chemical properties. Let's talk about ions. There are ions in the soil. There are negatively charged ions, and they are called anions. The positively charged ions are called cations. So you can kind of remember that by cats are positive, right? Cats are positive, that the negative ones are just called ions. Anions. Ew. Anyway, the cation exchange capacity, or CEC, is the measure of the soil's attraction, retention, and exchange of positively charged cations. Okay? The attraction between cations and soil particles minimizes leaching of positively charged ions. So you can see in the little diagram, you've got your negatively charged soil particles and your positively charged cations. And what does it do? It kind of clumps it together, right? That's how they make those lovely little aggregates, right? That's all the process. It's by these positively charged cations. Sandy soils have very little electrical charge, and so leaching happens more easily, okay? Sandy soils require more frequent applications of fertilizer because of that leaching, right? Saline soils have an excess of soluble salts, right? And sodic soils, the sodium is unusually high. They have a tendency to crust, like you see salt form, right? And they're associated with higher pH. So in order to fix something like that, when you see that occurring in your soil, you may need to add calcium to fix that issue. Okay? But knowing what type of soil you're dealing with in the first place really helps, right, in how to help your tree, right? So it's good to know these things. All right, let's talk about those biological properties. Ooh, nematodes. Oh, there's 20,000 different species of these little things. Some of them are very beneficial and others are parasitic, right? Some of them eat bacteria, which may be a good thing, but some of them may eat fungi, right? The good kind. So that might not be so good. And they also can eat the fine roots of your tree, which causes problems for the tree, right? If you have a nematode infestation of the wrong kind, right? So just knowing that, that's what these little mini worms do, right? Microscopic worms. That's what nematodes kind of are, right? In the rhizosphere is a zone of intense biological activity, and it's near those elongating roots, the ones that are going out and seeking, right? They're out pushing into the soil. That's your rhizosphere, is the zone of intense biological activity near those elongating roots. Keep that in mind. Mycorrhizae, they are fungus roots, right? And those fungus roots form a symbiotic relationship with the tree roots. Symbiotic means eating at the same table. So they hook themselves onto the ends of the root tips and they help the tree bring in more water, right? And nutrient. And in return, the tree, when it sends back down its sugars that it makes in the leaves, feeds the little mycorrhizae. So it's a very beneficial relationship. And this can really help a tree who's had issues with construction damage where the soils have been altered to put this mycorrhizae back, right? Because it's going to help the tree pull more water, which it's going to need to survive, right? So it's very beneficial, and just keep that in mind. That's what mycorrhizae does, right? But symbiotic means it's eating at the same table. And soil moisture and plant growth, the different soils, have different things that help the plant or don't help the plant. Clay soils have more total pore space and particle surface than sandy soils. Therefore, they have a higher water holding capacity, right? A soil is at field capacity when the gravitational water has drained away. All right. Keep that in mind. A soil is at field capacity when the gravitational water has drained away. The capillary water is the water that remains stored in those little micropores, right? So after the gravitational water is gone, then you have the little capillary water stored in the micropores, and that's what your tree's going to need, right? The permanent wilting point is when a tree will not recover until water is added to the soil. That means the permanent wilting point is where that tree has taken up all the capillary water and there's no more water available for the tree. That is your permanent wilting point, okay? Here's a little chart on soil moisture and its field capacity for different types of soil. So your field capacity up there in the red for your sand, sandy loam, silt loam, clay, and then clay loam, and then clay. So it looks like who has the most ability for water for field capacity? The clay loam and the clay, right? Yeah, but who has the most available water? Well, that's going to be your loam, right? Or your silt loam. And least available is going to be the sand, right? Because it's got the larger pores and everything runs right through it. Okay. So just a chart to help you realize which one does what, which soil is going to have a lower wilting point or a higher wilting point. So this is kind of how it works, moving from left to right. You get rain, some of it runs off, some of it infiltrates into the soil, right? And saturated soil is when it first rains and all the pores are filled with water, right? Then after a few days, you got drainage goes off to the bottom and goes out to the sides. And after a few days, then you're left with field capacity. So about half the pores are filled with water and the other half is air. Some of that becomes transpiration and evaporates. Some of that's taken up by trees. And then after weeks of no rain, you get to that wilting point, right? Plants can't get the water at the very bottom. They have to have the water that's in those pore spaces. They can't reach that far down to extract that remaining water. That is your wilting point. Okay. When I've taken all the water out of the micropores, I am now at my wilting point until I get more rain, right? Coarse textured soils like sand drain water very quickly. Fine textured soils like clay drain very slowly. If you put gravel in the bottom of a container or a planting hole, it does not improve the drainage of clay soils. I don't care how much gravel you put in there. All you've done is put gravel at the bottom of a clay hole, right? So it's not going to change how that clay drains at all. All right. So that's a myth. All right. In urban soils, you have maybe no organic layer left, right? We screw all that up. You may have compaction from lawnmowers and the house build and kids running in the yard and whatever else. You have a disrupted profile where we have now dug it up or smashed it down and put in a playground, whatever. You have elevated pHs from all the stuff we put on our grass trying to get it to look beautiful. We've altered the drainage in our urban soils. We want the water to flow away from our foundations. Well, that may not be good for the trees. Now, maybe water isn't flowing to them where it used to, or vice versa. Maybe they, get more water than they got in the past and they're drowning, So we alter the drainage. We put up subsurface barriers, retaining walls, curbs, things like that to keep the roads from going haywire, but we block our trees from being able to expand out. Same with those retaining walls. And of course, with all that, we've now created no biological activity in the soil. Who wants bugs in the yard? you know. Okay, perfect examples for a ivy covered yard here in Georgia. Now, for those of you that may not have ivy, it makes a thick, dense mat of roots and vines and you name it. It's like walking on a spring, right? When you walk through that stuff and then it tangles you all up. Well, imagine if you're a tree and your roots are underneath the roots of this mangled mass of ivy. Who's going to get the water? The ivy. Who's going to get the nutrients? The ivy. And eventually the ivy is going to grow up over your trunk and take over the tree. Now, is it really the ivy climbing on the tree that kills the tree off? No, it's the fact that it's taken up all the water and nutrients and the tree's not getting anything. But this is something that we've created, right? We brought that ivy in and then didn't maintain it. Oh, up on the right. Well, we put our trees so that we get some shade over our sidewalks, but look at the space you're asking that tree to live in, right? It's adjusted. It grew up there with the curb and the sidewalk behind it and the fence posts. But how long is it going to be able to survive there? And is it really getting what it needs? Probably not. All right. This one at the bottom I love because, not only have we put it in the strip between the sidewalk, the curb, and the street, but we've trapped it in with bricks to make sure it can't get away. I didn't know the tree was going to go anywhere. Obviously, the roots aren't going to go anywhere. So is this a long-term tree planting? No. At best, it'll be like these up at the top, maybe 60 years if we're lucky, and then they start to fail and decline. Urban soils limit root growth. We just saw examples of that. There's less aeration in the soil. There's less water infiltration. There's decreased biological activity. We interrupt the nutrient cycling. We rake off and blow off all the leaves that would have broken down and made nitrogens and other important minerals and nutrients for the tree. We got rid of all that. It lacks important organisms. So we've gotten rid of a lot of those bugs, So there are greater fluctuations in temperature. Now to all that heat load with the sidewalk and the road and our roofs and our bricks and our siding. So we've changed everything about this soil in an urban situation. And that's it for soils. So do we need another 5-minute break?
All right, anybody? Anybody opposed, or let's see here. Yeah, anybody opposed to a break? We intended for a 5-minute one, but if nobody needs it, we can push through to try and just keep rolling.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, let's keep rolling it.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Go to the next one. Now we're going to talk about water. Since we talked about soil, now we need to talk about water. Okay. All right, water management. Yep, trees need water. All right, in this chapter, we're going to go over water being vital to plants, just like it is to us, the influence of water on plant growth and health, water uptake, transpiration, and movement of water in the soil. We're going to talk about soil characteristics, its influence on soil aeration, water infiltration, and water holding capacity, factors that affect water loss and how plants manage that loss, right? The importance and methods of irrigation, and then potential problems with salinity, toxins, and using reclaimed water. There's a lot you have to do to make that work. All right. We have advantages of mulch and importance of good drainage. Trees absorb water and minerals dissolved in water, right? That's how they get what they need. Large trees can absorb hundreds of gallons of water in a single day. And as much as 95% of water is then transpired into the air by these trees. That helps to cool us, right? That's why it's always cooler under a tree, right, in the summer. Proper water management is key to a healthy tree. Irrigation is often necessary, especially in those urban planting sites, and it's critical with new trees. Okay, they have to have water because they've lost a lot of roots in that transplant process. So they really need to be able to get as much water as they need. All right. So the key factors in water management are the water requirements differ for different species, right? We talked about that. There are desert trees that don't need as much and trees that live in the water that can deal with a lot, right? The soil properties, the structure, the texture, the compaction, we just talked about that. Irrigation frequency, timing, and application technique, overwatering versus underwatering, right? Water conservation and drainage are critical, right? Because we have a finite amount of clean water. In fact, I think it's like 3 or 4% of the world's water is actually drinkable. Wow. There's a thought. All right. So available water, like we talked about, is capillary water, right? Capillary water is available water. And the amount of water in the soil between field capacity and permanent wilting, a soil texture determines water holding capacity, right? Infiltration is water movement into the soil. Percolation is water movement within the soil. So up, down, and sideways, right? Well, not so much up. Water doesn't tend to flow up. Sideways down, okay? Unless you're in one of those weird places where they've made the water run uphill. And I still don't understand that, but hey, whatever. Transpirational pull. So transpiration is the loss of water from the leaf surface, right? The leaves have tiny stomatal openings, and they're influenced by environmental conditions such as light, temperature, and humidity. So when water losses exceeds the plant's ability to take up water from the soil, wilting occurs, right? Let's look at the different water holding capacity on the effects of soil texture, okay? So in this diagram, you have in the light brown, you have excess or gravitational water, right? In the different types of soils, sand, loam, and silt clay. And the water in soil on the left in inches, right? Available water, which means no plant stress, is that kind of light brown color, right? Orangey brown. And you can see it's different. For sand, it's only about, what, 2 inches maybe inch and a half. Anyway, at 2.1 is your field capacity, right? And then you have a wilting point right after that. In loam, in that orangey tan area, you have much more water capacity, right? Available water. And in clay, you have a decent amount of water available, right? Available water plant stress can be possible is that darker brown layer. Okay, then you're getting into the water is starting to drain off. The plant has begun to take up water. You have much less available water in the sand. You have much more available water in the loam, and you have a little less water available in the silty clay loam. And then unavailable water is the whole red block. So silty clay loam, that clay mix is going to create the most unavailable water, right, to the tree at that 2.6 inch depth. And then sand drains off the fastest, right? So you're better off with a loam, basically, or a silty clay loam if you have to have something, or both are going to be better than sand. Your infiltration rate is the rate at which water soaks into the soil. Pretty simple. Soil texture plays a role in infiltration rates. Sandy soils, like I said, have a higher infiltration rate and they need frequent irrigation. Clay soils have a low infiltration rate and need less frequent irrigation, but it needs to be applied slowly for a longer duration. Okay. The percolation rate is the rate at which percolation occurs within the soil. The percolation rate is lower in clay soils than in sandy soils. You might want to make a note of that. Percolation rate is lower in clay soils than in sandy soils. Soil structure and bulk density affect percolation and infiltration. Okay. The water movement in the effects of soil texture, you can kind of see in this graph. This is from a pop-up emitter sprayer. And basically on that emitter, when it puts out, you note that your wetted zone has the greatest width below soil surface, right? So in clay, it spreads out, right, and infiltrates. In loam, it doesn't quite spread out as far, but it infiltrates much deeper. And in sand, it barely spreads out from the pop-up emitter and goes straight down, right? There's nothing to make it spread out. So that's kind of how it looks as it infiltrates into the water, right, and percolates. Drought. Tree species differ in water requirements and drought tolerance, right? They've learned their soils that they've grown in, right, for years and years. Root loss, leaf abscission, twig dieback, plant death. This is what occurs during drought, right? Trees may shed their leaves to respond to drought. Others become virtually dormant. They just go dormant. Some put out small leaves, provide a reduced surface area from which the water can escape through transpiration. Some trees have an extensive deep rooting system to help them deal with drought. Remember, a turgid leaf means it's fully hydrated. If the leaf is not fully hydrated, the leaf then begins to wilt, right? Trees with smaller, thicker, waxier leaves tend to be more drought tolerant. There's a reason those hollies are so waxy and hard, right? They're used to dealing with drought, right? Drought tolerant species for Georgia region is oaks, hollies, and elms, and junipers. Those do well when we have our droughts, right? Better than other trees will handle it and will need less water than everybody else. What are the symptoms of drought stress? Well, you have wilting, yellowing of the leaves, curling up of the leaf edge. Conifers turn yellow, red, brown, and purple, right? They stop being green, like it shows in this picture. Deciduous trees may develop a scorched, brown, burnt-looking leaf margin. They may put out smaller leaves if the leaf drop happens. The next leaves that come out will be much smaller, right? Tells you I'm in trouble. I'm in drought. I'm not getting enough water. A thin canopy up the top because it starts losing leaves. I can't support all these leaves. I can't continue to lose water, so I'm going to just let those leaves go as a tree, right? So I thin my canopy out and do leaf drop. And then you have pests, because when that happens, the trees put out pheromones. They go into stress mode, and now the little pests get involved and go, ooh, that looks like a meal. So you get things like spider mites moving in, right? because they're sensing that stress hormone. Drought stress symptoms for different trees. Here's your aspen leaf up on the left-hand corner. You can see it starting to yellow at the margins, right, at the outside of that leaf. The red oak will actually die back into the veins, and that's where it'll start showing color first. Pines will go from that beautiful green to brown, and orange. There's a couple different varieties that will turn different colors as they start to die back in that pine family, conifer family. Hackberries just wilt. They just look sad, right? They curl that leaf totally up. And then, at the bottom on the apples, they look burnt. That's one of those that looks scorched when it gets no water, right? Perfect example of drought stress symptoms in a tree. Here's an oak tree, okay? All right, so what do you think could be causing this problem? You're seeing that it's already lost major leaves from the top, right? So it's dropped its canopy leaves at the very top, trying to save as much water as it can, right? And that's how they die from drought stress. It's from the tips in, right? So it's called tip dieback. So all the tips are starting to die, right? And look at the heat load on this poor tree. We've got street, curb, and sidewalk and driveway. Then we have a gravel yard. They were kind enough to put a little mulch around the outside of that rock ring that they have it trapped in. And then we have these beautiful heat-shedding white roofs, which are great for bouncing heat off. But where does it go? Right, it goes right onto this tree in the front yard, which is already covered by, 78, 90%, heat-loaded stuff, nothing that's good. And no, I don't see a sprinkler system. So that's why this tree is dying. It's heat-loaded, it's in drought stress, and if something isn't done ASAP, this tree's not going to survive. Right. All right, drought stress may not kill a tree outright, but it does increase the susceptibility to insect and disease infestations in following years. Like I said, it's releasing that stuff, and now the insects are going to move in. Drought following periods of high rainfall can be damaging because the wet period encouraged that tree to put out a shallow root system, making the tree even more vulnerable to desiccation, right? So now I've got shallow roots. I'm not even going to get the water at the bottom that would be available to me because I didn't put roots out down there. Stress symptoms of drought may not show up for 2 years. It may be 2 years later before you see all this drop and things occurring, right? In the smaller leaf production and things like that. It may not show up for a couple of years. Drought is not good for trees. They need that water. We have to think about watering our mature trees when we're in that drought situation. Irrigation. Now, newly transplanted trees require added irrigation for a minimum of 2 years, right? They're going to be in that shock for about 2 years, right? Some recover faster if they're getting exactly what they need and we're done right at planting. But if not, it's going to be at least 2 years before they recover. Different tree species have different water requirements, like we talked about. Some are used to more water, some are used to less. Environmental factors play a role in determining the watering frequency needed, right? Your temperature, your humidity, your light, your wind, all that's going to affect how often you should water. You should probably water early in the morning or late at night. Why? Because the sun is not going to evaporate all the water that you just put out, right? So that's the best times to water. Watering after planting. You're going to take that hose and fill up the hole you just did, right? Then it's going to drain down. Then you're going to do it again until you get water that kind of stands. You don't want to flood it, but when you've got it to where it reaches that top level and then just starts to slowly disappear, don't water it anymore after that. It means the tree's taken up as much as it can. Aim for the root zone when you're irrigating a tree, right? Watering the root collar or the trunk, that could lead to fungal diseases. Watering that keeps leaf surfaces wet for extended period of times can also cause fungal infestations. So you want to water the root zone, not the entire tree. Doesn't need water up in the top, needs it at the bottom, at the roots. Let's talk about some sprinkler damage. This is what happens when you hit those, the sprinklers I'm talking about, the little jets that pop out and then move themselves around. Well, this is what it looks like when you stick one in the middle of a group of palm trees. All right, you get water damage from where that sprinkler has constantly wetted and hit that bark. It actually starts to rot. So this is bad evidence of sprinkler damage. Okay? That's what it looks like. Sprinkler irrigation, the most common method of watering are these little sprinklers, or the ones that wave back and forth, right? And that's fine if you're going to do it early in the morning or late at night. You wouldn't want these sprinklers running on top of these plants during the daytime because it's going to cause leaf scorch, right? That water that sits on top. And it can also bring in fungal pests. So you want to have the leaf be able to dry out. But this is a very common practice in nurseries, especially if they're not doing drip irrigation. Now, drip irrigation, that's the way to do it right there. It conserves water. Its moisture is directly within the root zone and can be maintained at field capacity because the water just drips out slowly, right? It minimizes soil erosion. It's a uniform distribution of the water. You can inject soil injections into the the water system for fertigation, right? So you can easily give these trees nutrient treatments or things like that. And the foliage remains dry, thus you don't get the fungal infestations, right? So drip irrigation is a great way to do it. This is kind of what a drip irrigation system looks like. This particular one uses a well. It pulls the water up, it goes through a screen and a filter, and then it's run out through the main lines to different valves and sublines. And then you have your poly tubes that run laterally, and you can either add more if you need to. That's why you crimp the ends of the tubes off, or you can open it up and add more tubing and create more plants. And each one drips enough of the water for the plants to survive. So it's a drip emitter on each one, but that's kind of how the system looks. You have a portable drip irrigation system, or PDIS, right? On the left, you have the gator bags. On the right, you have a tree diaper. Both these are designed to be filled up, and then they release water slowly through the bottom. The water seeps out through the bottom of the bag. There are small weep holes, and in the tree diaper, there's little holes in the bottom of that too, and it weeps out slowly. I believe that Tree Diaper has come out with one now that actually has material that the water can seep through on a rain event, so it fills up on its own and then seeps out. But both of these, they're temporary, right? They're not made to be left on the tree. It's just to get it through that first couple of years, and then you need to remove it. If you constantly give a tree water, it's going to demand that water bank. I know that sounds crazy, but they get used to the amount of water you're giving them. So now when you take the bags and things off, or you turn the sprinkler system off, and it doesn't get the rain that it was used to getting, it can cause it to wilt, right? Until it learns, oh, I'm only going to get this water every 2 to 3 weeks through the rainfall event. And that may take time. So just remember, they get used to the amount of water and they learn to survive with the water they're given. So these measures are only temporary, right? The PDISs. All right, minimum irrigation is to maintain the plants through periods of drought. Use drought-tolerant landscaping, or xeriscaping. That's what xeriscaping is drought-tolerant landscaping. You group plants with a similar water requirement in the same hydrozone. And you really have to understand a plant's water budget. How much does it really need? How much is it going to occur in evapotranspiration? Have soil moisture readers, or tensiometers. A tensiometer is a soil moisture reader, right? It's going to set how you do your application rates, what your infiltration rate is into your soil type, and it improves your irrigation system efficiency when you include these tensiometers, so you can actually get the water in that the trees need and not overdo it, right? Evapotranspiration, well, think back to school. I'm sure most of us went over this back then, but it's moisture lost by evaporation of the soil's water, and it also goes through the transpiration of the plant. So, it's that circle of rain, right, that we all looked at in science class. The water evaporates from the sea, and it goes up and condenses into clouds, and then it rains onto the trees. The trees do their thing and uptake. Some of the water runs back off into streams. Some of it goes into the groundwater. Some of it's uptaken by trees. And then when they have enough, they transpire that back into the atmosphere, which goes back into the condensation. And the whole circle just continues, right? All right. So that's the water cycle. Remember I said we were going to talk about water recycling, or recycled water? Recycled water can be high in salts as well as other chemicals, which can raise the soil pH and increase soil salinity. So irrigation water can be taken from landscape retention ponds that may have high levels of sodium and chloride salts, especially if they're near parking lot runoff, right? Leaf scourge can result from that. So you really need to check your water to see that it is in good shape and maybe include some filters if you're going to be using that kind of water, right? Successfully reusing recycled water depends on soil type, the water quality itself, and the sensitivity of your plants. And remember, good drainage is always essential. If you've got your plant standing in water or your tree standing in water, it's not going to survive, right? So class, what is this? And if you said sprinkler damage, you were correct. So the oak trees respond a little differently. And in this water area, they've got a higher iron content in the water, which makes where the sprinklers hit the trees look rusty, right? Red. But that's sprinkler damage on these oaks. So if you answered that way, good for you. All right, don't underestimate the power of mulch. Boy, mulch, mulch, mulch. It conserves water. It minimizes competition for weeds, right? So it gets rid of some of the weed competition. It reduces soil erosion, stops that from happening. It can improve soil aeration because it encourages the little, worms and all that kind of stuff and bugs moving through the soil, right? Keeps the soil cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. And it creates that nice manicured look. But there's a reason and a way to do mulch, right? You don't want to apply more than a 3-inch thick layer of organic mulch to at least an 8-foot diameter circle, right? Like it looks in the top picture. Apply a thinner 1-inch layer of mulch over the root ball if necessary, but keep it away from the trunk, right? You got to keep that away from the trunk, or that can trap moisture against the trunk. And please do not create mulch volcanoes. They're horrible, and they will do just what we talked about. They will create moisture against the trunk and create rot, right? And fungus conditions. So no mulch volcanoes. The result of for mulching, down she goes. And you can see the roots are gone, right? The trunk just rotted right at the root collar, and over they go, right? And that's from these mulch volcanoes. So don't do it. Just say no. Anti-transpirants, those can be used. They're chemicals that are sprayed on leaves, and they reduce transpiration. They form a thin coating on the leaf cuticle, and it's used during stress periods, right? So it's kind of designed to keep your tree from losing too much water out of the leaves, right out of those stomata. It can be phytotoxic, which means poisonous to some species of trees. Phytotoxic is poisonous to plants. Okay, might want to take note of that. Flooding, lack of oxygen in the soil suffocates those roots and creates anaerobic conditions. It creates mineral toxicities, fermentation of the root cells. Fermentation is great for beer, bad for trees. Okay. Prolonged flooding can lead to decay and fermentation of those roots. Flood tolerant species for our Georgia area are sweet gum, willow, green ash, and of course, bald cypress. They all can tolerate flooding better than others, right? When flooding happens, photosynthesis stops after a few hours under those flooded conditions. Transpiration slows way down, and root loss can occur within days. So trees become, at that point, prone to toppling over with wind events. And eventually, under flooded conditions, most species of trees will die. Okay? They're not already set up for that flood, like the bald cypresses with those knees. Even they can drown, right, and die if it's constantly flooded. Drainage is really important. Construction and landscape development. Stormwater runoff is increased due to increased impervious surfaces from development. They adjust the grade to allow for this drainage, and you have to plan in that whole development plan to accommodate your existing trees. Most places now require them to save trees. So you have to design that plan to save trees. So you have to take into consideration where all this water is going to go and how it's going to be there and where it's going to be stored if you're going to save existing trees. Sites with poor drainage, you can use drainage tiles. You can place them about 3 feet below the soil surface and above any hard pan. Wrapping drain tiles in geotextile fabric can help prevent the soil from penetrating those drains and keep them from backing up. Compaction, poor drainage, low oxygen. Many of our urban soils are compacted, have poor drainage. Many trees die or grow poorly because the roots need oxygen to grow. Remember, I can't draw up water if I can't get oxygen to draw the water up, right? Do plant in a situation like this where you're already hitting water at the bottom of your planting hole. Plant wet tolerant trees. Plant small or medium-sized trees. Don't choose trees with aggressive root systems, and plant shallower, so you're going to be not going as deep with that tree. You're going to be coming up in the root ball and mounding dirt over the top and spreading it out as opposed to putting it deep in the soil. Never a really great idea to plant trees deep, but we'll get into that in another chapter. Woo! All right, we're done with water. Anybody need a quick 5-minute break? How are we on time, Brittany?
We're at 11:17.
All right.
The one you have, I closed it up. If you were
I
trying.
did too. Hang on. It's the next one is tree selection. I think I can get through that. If they're willing not to take a break, I can probably get through that one.
All right. They say sure. Go for it.
Okay, folks, saddle up. We're going to go to the next one. All right.
Awesome. We're catching up time today.
All right. Tree selection. Oops, opened the wrong one. Sorry.
While she's getting that set up, has anybody got any questions? I haven't seen any in the Q&A in a while. All right.
Tree selection. Okay. Get a sip of coffee and we'll get going again. If you need to, you're in front of your screens. I can't tell if you're standing up, wiggling around, whatever. If you got to stand and stretch and move, please do so. All right. Here we go. Whoops, too many pages at once. All right, so we're going to go over the benefits of trees, site characteristics, tree characteristics, and selection of planting stock. Okay. What is the purpose of your tree? These are some important questions you got to ask before you go out there and pick a tree to plant, right? Talk to your client. What is the purpose of this tree? Is it for shade? Is it for fruit? What is it? What are the functional goals of the tree planting? What are we hoping to accomplish, right? What are the characteristics of the planting site? What type soils? How much water goes to that area? And then again, what are the characteristics of your tree? Are you going to be putting the right tree in the right place, right? What is this tree going to need? Not just now that it's little. Look at the books. Look at the pictures. Look at the specs. How big is this thing going to get? Are you putting it too close to a building and it's got a spreading crown? These are all things that you have to take into consideration and really ask your client or yourself where you're putting this tree and, what's its function going to be. So you need to match the tree and the site to the benefits of the tree, right? You want it to provide shade, provide aesthetics in the landscape, improve the air quality, reduce storm runoff, and improve water quality. They can create wildlife habitat. Maybe that's wanted, maybe that's not. You need to check with your client, right? Reduce the noise levels. There are trees that are planted for screening, right? And privacy. These are all benefits that trees can have. Match your tree and your site with its growth habitat and form, right? Its mature size. I love landscape architects. They pick some really cool stuff, but sometimes they forget what it's going to be like when it gets big, right? It's not going to stay that little triple trunk river birch in small, tiny form. It's going to get 60 to 80 feet tall. And if it's a triple trunk, 9 times out of 10, 1 or 2 of those trunks is going to fail. So that's going to be something to think about for the future, right? Its mature size, its attributes. What are its assets? What are its liabilities? Trees have liabilities? Yeah, they have liabilities. You wouldn't want to put something like a black walnut with those giant hard nuts up in the top right over a walkway. Oh, you better be giving people hard hats. Walk down that walk. They'll knock you out. All right, so they do. They have assets and liabilities. Pest resistance. If you've got a certain pest in the area and a certain tree is susceptible, I don't think I'd want to be picking that tree to plant. Drought tolerance. How much water are you going to get? Light requirements. How much light does this tree really need to survive, right? Is it an understory tree? It doesn't need so much. If it's an overstory tree, it's going to need light. Okay, these are all things to think about. Adaptability, your genetic ability to adjust to different environmental conditions. That's adaptability. Acclimation, well, that's the process by which trees adjust to the local environment. Might want to make note of that. Acclimation is the process by which trees adjust to the local environment. Adaptability is the genetic ability to adjust to different environmental conditions. Okay? Site analysis. What is there and what will be there? If this is a building site like this one, before I go putting new trees in the ground, I want to know what they've just done to tear all this dirt up. What's below the ground? Did they put in drainage systems? Where is the stormwater and the sewer lines and the water lines? How much rooting space is available to new trees in this situation, right? Above ground, what's there? Driveway, walkway, sidewalk. Local environment, how hot's it going to get? How cold's it going to get? Where does the wind direction come from? Urban factors, right? What's the likelihood that this place is going to freeze and they're going to put salt all over the roads that might run into this tree's root system? And its maintenance requirements. How much maintenance is this tree going to use? How can I help the client do that? So all this is part of your site analysis and figuring out what you're going to plant where. Below ground, you got to look at what your soil characteristics are. What's the texture? What's its compaction? Are we going to need to decompact this area? Moisture and drainage, your fertility and pH. What is the pH of this soil? Have it tested. Temperature, does it get hot? Is it freezing? Contaminated. What was here before? Was this a used car facility that got torn down? They were dumping oil. What is in this soil that may be contaminated? Testing that soil is really important, and all that is part of your site analysis process. Where are the underground utilities? And how much rooting space do I have? So let's look at these rooting space issues. All right, tree on the left, trapped by sidewalk, driveways, curb, and road. Tree on the right, same issue. And did it have enough root to be able to survive after they dug and killed the roots behind the tree, right? Where they redid the sidewalk? Nope. Resulted in what? Quercus horizontali. Yep, tree's over, right? It's not going to survive that. You can't stand that back up. So the tree's gone. The one in the bottom, we bricked it, which, hey, that may allow, these pavers may allow water to get in there. But then we had a problem with people doing stuff to the trees, so then they fenced it in, right, to keep people out of there. That's good. But really, how much rooting space does this thing really have? It's totally covered in brick, right? And then on either side of that, you've got pavement and walkway. So not good rooting space. You've got to analyze how much root system the tree's going to need, how big it's going to get, and can it survive where you're putting it. Above ground, let's not create these giant monsters that eat power lines, because that's how they're going to trim them. Everybody's seen this, where the power company has got to have that clearance on 25 feet. It's supposed to be 25 feet on either side of that line, right? And they're just going to hack the tree up, just like it sits right here in this picture, to make sure the line is cleared, because we don't want to lose power, right? So look up before you plant your tree and keep in mind how big that tree is going to get. Same thing with parking lot trees. Yeah, we want to do shade, but if it's a light post location, now you've put a tree there, it's going to block all the light. What's the client going to do? They're going to prune the tree, right? And probably not well. So let's think about this as to where we put these light poles in relationship to where we're planting our trees. Here's a good one that is usually with right tree, right place for most of the power companies. So you got your tall trees at least 50 feet away from the line that are going to get up to 80 feet. Then you have a 40-foot height or less within 50 feet. And then 20 feet to the line, you've got a 25-foot or less height. And then within 10 feet of that trunk, nothing. I mean, the pole, nothing. They don't want anything planted within 10 feet of the pole. And that allows the correct space, and no tree's going to take down the line in a wind event or storm event. That's the idea of this. So it's a good rule of thumb, and you can find these right tree, right place pamphlets all over the place with the power companies. All right, so you're going to look at your local environment for your site analysis. What is directly around this house? So you've got environmental factors. You've got light exposure. You've got temperature extremes. You have precipitation, where the rain's going to come in from, your wind pattern, where's the prevailing wind for your area, the air quality, where is there a lot of pollution maybe coming through? You've got roads that are going to have a lot of exhaust and stuff coming through, and other trees. It's basically a little microclimate around this house. And so you have to look at all that, where your existing trees are. Maybe they want a view, right? So you don't want to put a new tree there. It's going to block the view. You don't want to plant under the power lines. You don't want to plant right up against the house where it hasn't got enough space. So you kind of got to look at this little microclimate and your local environment on the client's property where you're going to plant this tree, and look at all these factors, right? Urban forests, boy, you have issues there. You have site location with paved areas, structures, overhead wires, security lights, underground utilities, regulations from the city or municipal jurisdictions. You have, unfortunately, vandalism, people carving names in trees and things like that. And what is the design criteria for this project, right? What are they trying to accomplish? Is it shading and reducing of the heat load? Probably. So these are all things you're going to want to think about. You're going to want to think about, if you're close to that golf course, maybe putting a barrier to keep the guys that had one too many on the course from running into your palm tree. Okay. You're going to look at where your guardrails are going to be. Now, look, they planted this tree and it is happily munching away on this guardrail, but nobody thought about that when the tree was planted, right? So they not only grow up, they grow out. So you have to take that into consideration. There's a perfect example of carving on these poor beech trees. But eventually enough of that can really damage and kill the tree. And then space requirements. I mean, those roots are going to lift your sidewalk panels. You're going to cause tripping hazards. And really, is that long term? No. But these are just some examples of things you got to look at. For your site considerations, like I said, your design criteria is based on the landscape functions that tree will serve. In your engineering and architecture, in the routing of traffic, is the tree going to create camouflage for something like a dumpster area? Is it just reducing the heat load, climate modification? Is it for aesthetics? Then maybe you want to pick a blooming tree, right? If you have signage, you're going to want a tree that's going to get tall enough to not block the sign, right? Or short enough to not block the sign. Yeah, and not close enough to where it is going to block the sign. So just things to think about on these site analyses. How are you going to get your irrigation for your maintenance requirements? Who's going to prune them? Fertilization, it'll probably need them if they're in, soils that have been amended. Pest control, who's going to treat them to make sure that the pests in your area don't get them? And cleanup, what kind of cleanup's going to be involved? If you got fruit trees planted or berry trees planted near cars, you got leaf litter, you've got all kinds of stuff that you got to think of for cleanup with these trees. All right, so let's talk about its assets, right? The tree's attributes, their function, right? Canopy versus, canopy density. How thick is that canopy going to be, right? Is it created for shade? Then you want to pick a spreading trunk tree that's going to create some shade, right? How big is it going to be, right? Mature size. What's its form? Is it going to fit the space? A spreading, live oak tree may not do well near a building, right? How long is it going to live? Are you planting for a 30 or 40-year planting that you're going to have to replace? Well, then maybe you want to pick a variety that doesn't live that long. Water oak comes to mind. That's our shortest lived oak, Anyway, you got to think about all that. How long is going to last? Ornamental traits. Does it have exfoliating bark? Is it evergreen? Do they need a screening? Well, if you're not planting an evergreen, you're not going to have a screen in winter. Then you got to think about that, right? Its growth rate. How fast is it going to get big enough to do what it needs to do? And its habit, growth habit, its branching pattern, wood strength. Would you want to plant a weak wooded tree that's going to self-limb over a parking lot? This is probably not a good idea. These are all things you have to think about. We talked about tree growth forms. Well, here's an example of them all. They can be round, spreading, pyramidical, like I talked about, oval, conical, vase-shaped, columnar. Columnar varieties are very interesting. You can get oaks and elms and these trees that are usually spreading. Well, now they're coming out in this dense, tightly packed crown, even beech trees, called columnar. But you got to remember that is not going to give you the canopy credit like If you're thinking about this thing for giving some shade, that's not going to happen with a columnar variety. So you have to know what type of tree and what form it's going to stay in, right? Open, weeping, irregular. These are all different tree growth forms. Like I talked about, its attributes, well, they also have liabilities, right? Fruits that are going to fall all over people's cars or stain their clothing or whatever when they fall or hit them in the head. Um, uh, is it rooting up above ground like maples tend to do? Creates a trip hazard. Might not be something you want in a playground. The ones with spikes, hawthorns and locusts, devil's walking stick, even Bradford pear. Not that I want anybody planting those, but they have thorns that you really have to consider. You don't want to spec out devil's walking stick, which is extremely thorny, in a playground area. I actually had a landscape architect do that. Why? I don't know. Maybe he wanted to keep the children out of an area. Well, I can think of other ways to do it. And then, the berries and things like that. Is that going to cause a problem? And it attracts more birds? Is that what you want over your parking lot? Birds, bunch of birds in the trees equals bunch of bird stuff on the cars. Think about this. They have liabilities too. Different trees do well in different zones. So what's the tree's hardiness zone? Will it survive where you're proposing to plant it? What's the possibility for wind and storm damage? What are the light requirements that trees need? Pollution tolerance. Is it one that can handle a bunch of, car exhaust fumes, right? May not be one that can handle that. And there are trees that handle it better than others, right? Pest resistance or susceptibility to pests. You got to think about all this stuff. Like I said, this bottom example, you don't want a weak wooded tree where people are going to be walking, because when self-limbing happens, it's going to drop that limb, Yeah. Tree species sources. Native trees usually grow well in their natural range. Introduced species or non-native or exotic species can also be very successful, but there can also be problems. Naturalized species, which reproduce and thrive in their new settings, they can be very valuable, or may become invasive, which is something you don't want, because then it's going to crowd out your native species. So native selections, we love to see them. The southern magnolia, that's native. The white flowering dogwood, that's native. The Kusa dogwood, however, is not. It comes from China, but it is not invasive. So you can plant it in our Piedmont area, and it's not going to freely take over by itself. That's not how they work. But there are other varieties that will take over, like your mimosa trees, right? Here are very invasive. And do they grow well? Sure, they grow like wildfire. And that's the problem. They're crowding out our natives. So you want to try and pick natives when you can. Like I said, there are some selection species that are introduced that are not not invasive, like the eucalyptus, ginkgo biloba, and Kusa dogwoods. They do fine. Choke cherries, mimosas, and Chinese tallow, very invasive. They're going to crowd out your natives, so we don't encourage planting those. Select your trees at the nursery. When you're checking trees at the nursery, you're going to be looking for healthy, well-balanced crowns with dark green foliage, if that's the type of tree you're looking for. If it's a light gray foliage, you want to make sure it's the correct color, right? You want one dominant trunk with evenly distributed branches, good stem, caliper, and taper, right? It's developed naturally. You want healthy roots with a good lateral root distribution, no insect or disease problems. I don't want to buy something that's covered in spider mites already, and no stem or branch injury. How careful was this grower? If it's already got wounds on the tree, that wound is there forever. They don't heal. All they can do is seal off, but that wound is there forever. So you're going to be picking one without injuries. What's its production method? These are also things you have to consider. What's its maximum size available at planting? What's the condition of that root ball? Was it done correctly? What's the root collar location? Has it been buried in excess soil? The caliper and height relationship, right? So is the trunk width enough to support the trunk length, right? Trunk, branch, and structure. Does it have good branching patterns, right? What is the condition of your leaves? Is the crown uniform? All these things you're going to look at when you're checking out your trees to buy. There are 3 nursery stock types. You have bare root, comes with no dirt, covered in a gelatinous goo to keep it moist, right? Or in a bag, a wax sealed bag or container to keep it from drying out. Ball and burlap is dug in the field and wrapped up in burlap, synthetic or real, and then wrapped with wire or twine and sealed up, right? And then you have containerized that have been grown in pots. Those are the 3 types of stock. Questions?